The frozen plains of Narith 9 stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of tarnished steel. The world had no trees, no hills, no sound but the groan of ice shifting beneath the pressure of its own age. The cadets of the Galactic Academy had arrived 3 days ago, sent here to prove their endurance and resourcefulness in conditions no civilization would ever choose to live in. It was supposed to be a controlled test, monitored from orbit, with clear instructions and enough supplies to last a week. But nothing on Narith 9 ever followed human or alien expectations. Evan Cole stood at the edge of the temporary encampment, his boots crunching into brittle frost. His breath formed clouds that froze almost instantly, turning into glittering dust that fell around him like ground-up glass. Around him, tents rose in precise formations, shimmering with the faint reflections of light from the camp's plasma lamps. The alien cadets worked in silence, their movements quick and mechanical. They trusted their materials, polyfiber, exosilk, thermal plating. To them, the cold was just a problem of engineering. But Evan knew that the planet's storms were not simply weather. They were living forces that tore apart everything arrogant enough to stand against them. The instructors had left in their shuttle at dusk, promising to return in 7 cycles. By then, the cadets were to have built functioning shelters, heat sources, and sustainable food supplies. The first 2 days went according to plan. The sky was a dull gray, the wind strong but manageable. Evan's group had shared water, food paste, and heat packs. Some species had constructed sleek metallic domes, resistant to temperature change. Others had dug trenches to reduce exposure. Evan had built a low tent reinforced with fiber mesh, following the Academy's basic survival manual. It looked efficient enough until the 3rd night arrived. The storm began with sound. A distant moan rolled across the plains, low and drawn out, like the cry of something ancient beneath the ice. The alien cadets ignored it at first, busy checking the integrity of their shelters. Then the moan deepened into a roar, and the first gust of wind hit the camp like an invisible wall. The temperature plummeted so fast that the air itself seemed to crack. Evan turned just in time to see a neighboring structure collapse as its thermal anchors ripped free from the ground. Shards of frozen air hard as gravel pelted the camp. Plasma lamps flickered and went out one by one. The storm thickened into a white chaos that swallowed everything. Voices rose in panic, shouts in alien tongues, the metallic screech of tools, the thud of collapsing supports. Evan crawled toward his tent, clutching his goggles as the wind tore at him. He managed to slip inside, sealing the flap behind him. The fabric strained, bending inward under the weight of the air. Inside, the temperature gauge blinked red warnings. He heard the sound of something tearing. Then the tent's side ripped open, a clean line sliced by airborne ice. Cold slammed into him like a blow. He ducked instinctively, covering his face. The air was sharp enough to draw blood. His fingers went numb within seconds. He tried to grab the emergency sealant, but it froze solid before it reached the tear. The wind roared louder, pushing through the breach until the entire structure folded in on itself. Evan rolled out before it collapsed completely, dragging his survival pack behind him. The night outside was a blur of white and silver. He could barely see 10 feet ahead, yet he could hear everything. The alien screams, the sounds of equipment skidding across the frozen ground, the hollow bang of debris striking ice. He stumbled toward the faint outline of a larger dome, one built by a group of Farron cadets, whose crystalline skin gave them a natural tolerance for cold. They waved at him, gesturing for him to come closer, but the wind shifted suddenly, and the structure imploded under the pressure. Transparent panels shattered like glass, sending the cadets scattering. Evan ducked as fragments sliced past him, one cutting a shallow line across his arm. He gritted his teeth and pressed his glove against the wound, feeling warmth seep through the fabric, only to freeze almost instantly. The storm didn't relent. It built momentum. It screamed across the plains, peeling away anything that wasn't buried or fused to the ice. The air was thick with snow that burned like acid against skin. Evan dropped to his knees and crawled, keeping low. He thought of his instructors orbiting above, watching through thermal lenses. But deep down, he knew that the storm was stronger than the Academy's expectations, stronger than any simulated trial. It was real. It wanted to erase everything that dared exist on its surface. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time dissolved into the endless noise. Evan reached a cluster of fallen structures and crawled beneath a broken support beam. It offered almost no protection, but it was enough to block the direct force of the wind. He pulled out his emergency blanket, thin, metallic, reflective, and wrapped it around himself. The storm howled above him, shaking the ice. Somewhere nearby, a light flickered weakly, then vanished. He felt the vibration of the world beneath him, deep, resonant, alive. The planet was moving, the ice flexing under the immense weight of the storm. He thought of home then, not Earth itself, but the cold mountain nights in the north where he had trained as a boy. His instructor back then, a survivalist named Hart, had told him that comfort kills faster than the cold. Never trust warmth that comes from power, the man had said. Trust what comes from the ground, from your own breath. Evan had never understood it until now. The noise outside grew stranger. It wasn't just the wind. It was pressure, vibration, resonance. It made the air inside his lungs shake. He knew that most of the alien species relied on technology to regulate body temperature. Without it, their internal systems would begin to fail within hours. He had seen some of them, tall, graceful beings with translucent skin, collapse when the storm first hit, their suits cracking like eggshells. Even those who managed to cling to life huddled together, unable to fight the storm's sheer will. Evan closed his eyes and focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He could feel the edges of frost forming around his lashes. He forced his mind to remain alert. The human body, he reminded himself, was built for endurance, not strength. On a planet like this, intelligence and patience mattered more than any synthetic shield. But as the minutes dragged on, even he began to feel his thoughts slow, his heartbeat heavy and sluggish. He pressed his back against the ice and realized something. Despite its coldness, the ice wasn't the enemy. It was stable, solid, alive with tiny air pockets. It trapped warmth when handled right. The snow around him wasn't just a burden, it was material. Nature had always offered the means to survive. It was arrogance that blinded beings from using it. As the wind screamed overhead, he decided that if he lived through the night, he would no longer depend on the fragile technology issued by the Academy. He would build something that belonged to this world. The storm intensified again, louder, more violent, a crescendo of nature's fury. The alien shelters continued to vanish one by one, reduced to splinters that scattered across the plains. Yet, beneath the chaos, Evan stayed conscious, his thoughts circling one single truth. This planet wasn't unbeatable. It simply demanded understanding. The others had built walls against it. He would learn to build with it. When dawn finally hinted at the horizon, a faint gray light filtering through the blizzard, the camp was gone. Only fragments of material and half-buried figures marked where proud shelters once stood. Evan rose from his pit, shaking frost from his hair. The storm had quieted to a whisper, leaving behind a silence so vast it seemed sacred. He looked across the wreckage and saw movement, survivors crawling out, dazed and half-frozen. He knew more storms would come. This one had only been the beginning. As he stood amid the ruins, his breath steady and his hands stiff with cold, a strange calm filled him. He had seen what the others hadn't. The storm was not a punishment. It was a lesson. Every gust, every tear in the sky had shown him that nature didn't destroy without offering balance. Beneath the violence of wind and frost was structure, logic, and possibility. And in that moment, as the world groaned and cracked beneath his boots, Evan decided that the next time the storm came, he wouldn't hide. He would build something that could stand against it, not by defying its power, but by working with it. When the first light broke through the dissolving haze, the world seemed hollowed out. The storm had left nothing untouched. Ice dunes replaced the once flat plain, their surfaces glittering like shards of glass beneath a pale sun. The camp was gone, obliterated. Only fragments of equipment and the pale outlines of destroyed shelters remained. Evan stood in the middle of it, silent, breathing steam into the frozen air. Around him, a few surviving cadets stumbled through the wreckage, their limbs stiff from cold and exhaustion. No one spoke. The silence after the storm was more terrifying than the storm itself, as if the planet had swallowed sound. Evan's own shelter had vanished completely. Only a twisted fragment of its metal pole stuck out of the ice near his feet. He knelt beside it, brushing away snow to uncover a half-buried thermal pack. It was dead, its energy cell drained by the freezing winds. He pocketed the empty casing anyway. On a world like Narith 9, nothing was useless. The cadets around him were attempting to rebuild in panic, shoveling snow to make trenches, erecting broken panels against the wind. He knew it was futile. He could feel another front of cold air rolling across the horizon, distant but unmistakable. The storm would return before nightfall. The others didn't understand how this world worked. They still believed that technology could shield them. He could see the Farron cadets, crystalline beings whose skin refracted sunlight, trying to patch a cracked dome with fusion tape. He could see the scaled Riths heating metal plates to melt the snow into water. Every action they took relied on systems that couldn't endure what was coming. Evan watched for a long moment, his jaw clenched. He respected their determination, but he had already made his choice. He wasn't going to rebuild. He was going to adapt. He began walking, moving away from the remnants of the camp. The wind was calmer now, but it still carried the deep groan of shifting glaciers. He moved toward the faint ridges that stretched to the east, where the ice layers stacked like ancient pages. Each step crunched beneath his boots. Each exhale turned to frost. His fingers were stiff. His face burned from cold, but his mind was alive with the rhythm of purpose. He reached the first ridge after an hour. The formation rose almost 15 feet high, a natural wall sculpted by centuries of compressed storms. The surface was a mix of blue and white bands, alternating between translucent and opaque. He ran his gloved hand across it and felt the subtle give beneath his touch. It wasn't just frozen water. It was dense snow layered with trapped air pockets. Perfect insulation if shaped correctly. He crouched, scraping away a section with his knife until a small block came loose. The cut surface gleamed, and when he held it to the light, he could see the faint shimmer of air bubbles within. It was porous, alive, almost breathing. That was when the memory returned. The mountain nights of his training, when Hart, his old mentor, had spoken about the ways of old Arctic explorers, men who built warmth out of the very thing that threatened them. They hadn't fought the snow, they'd embraced it. Evan stood, feeling the weight of that idea settle in his mind like an ember of fire in the cold. He could build a dome, not from steel or plastic, but from the planet's own bones. He tested his theory by carving another block, this one larger and more precise. The ice responded easily to the rhythm of his movements. He cut, lifted, and stacked 2 blocks together. The edges fused slightly as their surfaces melted under the friction of his gloves, then refroze, binding solid. The connection was seamless. It was primitive, but it worked. He smiled faintly, a rare flicker of warmth against the frozen emptiness. When he returned to the remains of the camp, the surviving cadets barely noticed him. Most were too busy salvaging whatever pieces of their shelters they could find. Some were arguing in broken galactic common about the next steps. A group of scaled cadets were insisting they migrate toward the southern ridge to find geothermal vents. Another group wanted to wait for the instructors. None of them had a plan that could last. Evan didn't try to convince them otherwise. Survival, he had learned, wasn't about debate. It was about action. He found an isolated patch of ice near a shallow dip in the ground. The terrain there curved slightly, offering natural protection from the wind. He dropped his pack and began working immediately. The first task was to build tools. He broke apart one of the remaining metal poles and sharpened the end by scraping it against a shattered piece of plating. It became a crude but effective chisel. With that, he started cutting into the ice ridge beside him, forming uniform blocks about 1/2 meter wide. The work was exhausting. Each block weighed more than 20 kilograms, and his hands shook with effort. But he kept at it, breathing rhythmically, carving with a steady pace. The sun, if it could be called that, barely moved in the sky. Its dull light stayed trapped behind clouds of frozen vapor. Hours passed. Sweat froze against his back. His gloves stiffened from the cold. By the time he had 15 blocks, his muscles ached, and his breath came out in short bursts. But when he stacked the first few into a ring, a sense of quiet satisfaction replaced the fatigue. The circular foundation gleamed faintly in the dim light. It looked fragile, yet it felt solid beneath his touch. He paused and looked around. A few cadets had noticed him now. Some pointed in confusion, whispering to each other. One of the Farron approached, her crystalline body glinting weakly in the sun. Her voice, though muffled by the cold, carried a tone of disbelief. "You're using ice to keep warm?" she asked, incredulous. Evan didn't answer. He simply nodded once and returned to his work. She stood there for a moment longer, then shook her head and walked away, convinced he had lost his mind. But he wasn't wrong. The more he built, the more sense it made. He arranged the blocks in an upward spiral, each one leaning slightly inward to distribute the weight evenly. The dome began to take shape, a smooth curve that defied the violent angles of the landscape. Each piece locked into the next, fusing together with thin layers of melted frost that froze again in seconds. When he reached the halfway point, he paused to reinforce the base with snow packed tightly between the seams. The structure grew stronger with every layer, its weight pressing down to create even more stability. As he worked, the wind began to pick up again. The sky darkened to a bruised gray, the edges of the next storm gathering. The other cadets scrambled to secure their shelters, but Evan didn't stop. He moved faster, driven by instinct and focus. He could feel the air pressure dropping, the temperature sinking. His hands were numb, his lips cracked and bleeding, but the rhythm of his movements kept him alive. Cut, lift, stack, melt, seal, freeze. The dome rose higher. By the time the first flakes of snow began to fall again, the structure was nearly complete. He crouched inside, sealing the last opening with smaller fragments and snow packed tight like mortar. Then he crawled through a narrow entrance tunnel he had carved at the base. The inside was dimly lit, glowing faintly blue as light filtered through the walls. It was silent. The sound of the wind outside was muffled to a soft hum. He could hear his own heartbeat again. The air was cold, but still, without the biting sting of the open storm. He sat in the center surrounded by the luminous ice and exhaled slowly. For the first time since the storm began, the air he breathed didn't freeze his lungs. The structure worked. The dome captured his body heat, trapping it in the space between the ice layers. It wasn't warmth by any civilized measure, but it was life. He took out the remnants of alien wool from his pack, a thick fabric woven for thermal regulation, and laid it out along the floor. When he sat upon it, he felt a faint, almost luxurious comfort. Outside, the wind roared again, shaking the surface of the dome, but the structure held. The planet seemed to test his creation, pressing its fury against it, only to meet resilience. Evan listened, his eyes half closed. The sound was distant now, almost soothing. The storm would come and go as it pleased, but for the first time, he no longer felt like prey. As the snow thickened and the daylight faded into the endless twilight of Narith 9, he rested against the curve of the wall, his breath rising in thin spirals of steam. He didn't know how long the dome would last, or if the others would survive the next night. But he knew one thing with certainty. The path forward wasn't in fighting the planet. It was in understanding its rhythm. And in that quiet, frozen dome, lit by the faint blue glow of the ice, Evan found his rhythm too. The dim blue light filtering through the frozen walls shifted as the second storm arrived. Evan lay awake inside the dome, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the wind pressing against the outer shell. The storm no longer sounded like chaos to him. It was a language, one that spoke in tones of pressure and vibration. He could tell when the gusts came from the north by the way the air shifted at the dome's entrance, or when the ice above expanded slightly under tension. What had once been a force of destruction now felt like something alive and predictable, something he could coexist with rather than resist. He stood up, the crunch of frost beneath his boots echoing softly through the enclosed space. The air was thin but breathable, his own warmth slowly building inside. He placed his hand on the inner wall. It was cool to the touch, but not biting. The ice was layered perfectly, compacted, and self-insulating. He could see tiny beads of moisture glistening near the seams where the friction of his movements had generated microheat. The structure was alive with balance, a meeting point between the brutality of the storm and the precision of human ingenuity. The dome was silent except for the faint hum of the wind outside. His gear, arranged neatly along one side, looked almost alien in contrast to the organic simplicity of his surroundings. He had lined the interior floor with strips of alien wool, scavenged from damaged supply packs. The fibers, designed for high thermal retention, absorbed body heat and reflected it evenly. Lying upon them felt like resting on a living organism, soft, flexible, and strangely comforting. It was primitive and advanced at once. He decided to improve the structure before the storm reached its full strength. Moving carefully, he took out a small cutting tool and carved ventilation slits near the dome's top, small enough to prevent drafts but large enough to allow moisture to escape. The previous night, he had noticed condensation forming on the upper walls, which could eventually weaken the structure. The problem was simple physics, warm air from his breath rising, hitting the cold ceiling, freezing, and dripping down again. By creating vents, he could maintain equilibrium. It was a small adjustment, but survival often depended on such details. After securing the vents, he turned his attention to insulation. The alien wool alone wasn't enough for long-term stability. He dug a shallow trench around the base of the dome and packed snow into it, pressing hard until it froze solid. The trench acted as a reinforcement ring, sealing heat inside while reducing external pressure from drifting ice. Every movement was deliberate, almost meditative. He had entered a state where logic and instinct blended seamlessly. His thoughts no longer drifted to escape or rescue. His entire existence was focused on improving this single, fragile space, a cocoon of survival in a world determined to erase him. By mid-cycle, the storm's intensity doubled. Wind screamed like a living beast, and the horizon disappeared behind a curtain of snow so dense it looked like a wall. The cadets scattered across the plain were invisible now, reduced to faint shadows beyond the frost. Evan knew many would not endure another night. He wanted to help, but stepping outside now would be suicide. He had made peace with that fact. He could only ensure his own endurance and hope his work would later serve as a model for others. He crawled back into the dome, sealing the entrance with a slab of ice that fit snugly into the tunnel he had carved. The world outside vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, tranquil quiet. Inside, the air was calm. He ignited a small chemical lamp and set it near the center of the dome. Its pale yellow flame painted the ice with golden reflections, transforming the interior into something almost sacred. The temperature began to rise by a few degrees, just enough to melt the top layer of frost. Tiny droplets formed on the walls, catching the light and scattering it like stars. He took off one glove, holding his bare hand near the lamp. The warmth bit pleasantly at his fingers, bringing color back into his skin. He stared at the flame, lost in thought. He realized that survival wasn't about clinging to life in fear. It was about creating balance between yourself and the environment. The storm would always come. The planet would always try to test him, but his will to adapt was stronger than its intent to destroy. The dome was proof of that. It wasn't resistance. It was harmony. When he finally lay down to rest, exhaustion caught up to him all at once. The soft fibers beneath him embraced his weight. The lamp flickered softly, reflecting against the curved walls that glowed faintly blue and gold. His breath came steady and slow, creating a rhythm that matched the muffled heartbeat of the storm outside. For the first time since arriving on Narith 9, he slept without fear. Hours later, a low rumble woke him. The dome trembled faintly, the ice shifting under external pressure. He sat up instantly, adrenaline surging. A crack formed near the entrance, thin, spider-like, glowing faintly white against the rest of the wall. He grabbed his tool and pressed his palm against the fracture. It wasn't structural failure. It was surface tension caused by sudden temperature change. He knew how to fix it. He took a handful of snow, pressed it into the crack, and exhaled warm air over it until it refroze. The walls sealed again, smoother than before. The act took less than a minute, but it reinforced something deeper in him. A quiet confidence that he could not only survive here, but master the conditions that terrified others. Once the immediate danger passed, he decided to test another idea. He retrieved the remnants of a reflective emergency blanket from his pack and stretched it across one wall of the dome, securing the edges with melted ice. The material caught and magnified the faint glow of the lamp, turning the interior brighter and warmer. It was almost comfortable now, the closest approximation of a home one could have on this planet. He smiled slightly, though no one could see it. Later, when he stepped outside to gather more snow, he noticed that the storm had thickened into an impenetrable wall of white. Visibility was nearly zero. Yet, within a few meters of his dome, he spotted faint shapes, figures crawling, staggering, searching for shelter. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to shout, to call them toward the dome, but the wind devoured every sound, and he knew the storm would bury him alive if he strayed too far. Still, he couldn't ignore the faint outline of one cadet lying motionless near the ridge. He tightened his hood and crawled toward the shape, dragging a rope tied to the dome's base so he wouldn't lose his direction. The cold cut through him like shards of glass. The snow clawed at his face and his eyes watered from the freezing air. When he reached the fallen cadet, he recognized the crystalline skin of a Farron, the same one who had mocked his ice building earlier. Her outer layer had fractured, her body half covered in snow. She was alive but fading, her breathing shallow. Evan didn't hesitate. He wrapped the rope around her torso and began pulling her back toward the dome. Every step was agony. The wind tore at them, threatening to lift them off the ground. By the time he reached the entrance, his limbs felt like stone. He dragged her inside and sealed the tunnel. The moment the sound of the storm faded, the silence returned, thick and almost holy. He removed her frozen gloves and pressed her hands against the warm wool lining. Her body twitched. He ignited another lamp and placed it beside her. Gradually, color returned to her face, and her breathing steadied. She opened her eyes hours later, the faint blue light of the ice reflecting in them. Confusion crossed her expression as she looked around, her lips barely moving when she whispered, "This is warm." He only nodded, saying nothing. She tried to sit up, but he motioned for her to stay still. The dome could barely fit both of them, yet it felt vast compared to the endless white outside. The storm raged for another full day. During that time, Evan maintained the lamps, rotated the wool layers, and reinforced the dome when the outer pressure increased. The Farron watched in silence, still weak, but no longer afraid. She had seen the impossible, comfort within the storm. At one point, when the wind outside hit a frequency that made the entire structure hum softly, she whispered, "You built this from ice." He looked at her briefly and replied, "Ice keeps the cold out when you understand how to shape it." When the storm finally passed, light seeped back into the world. The ice walls sparkled like diamond dust. The Farron sat in quiet awe, tracing her fingers along the curved surface. She had thought the human was reckless, primitive even, but now she understood. This dome wasn't just survival, it was creation. It was proof that life could thrive anywhere if guided by patience and understanding. As Evan opened the entrance and stepped outside, the air was still bitterly cold, but the sky had cleared enough to reveal the fractured horizon. The plains were littered with debris from other shelters, but none stood intact. Only his dome gleamed untouched, its smooth surface glistening like a frozen jewel amid the devastation. He looked at it for a moment, then turned his gaze to the horizon. He wasn't done. The planet had more to teach him, and he was ready to listen. When dusk fell again, the horizon dimmed into a frozen twilight, and the air thickened with the kind of stillness that came before violence. Evan felt it before it happened. The pressure drop, the thin shiver in the ice beneath his boots, and the faint metallic taste in the air that meant another storm was coming. He stood outside the dome, his face half covered by a thermal hood, watching how the sky turned from gray to violet to black. The world seemed to hold its breath. The Farron woman sat just inside the dome's entrance, wrapping herself tighter in the wool layers he had given her, her crystalline skin reflecting the low light like shards of glass. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The planet was about to remind them again who ruled here. The wind arrived like a scream. One moment the air was silent, the next it was full of invisible claws tearing at everything that stood above the surface. The first gust hit him with such force that it staggered him backward. Snow rose in waves, sweeping across the plain, devouring the faint outlines of wreckage left from the last storm. He turned quickly and crawled into the dome, sealing the entrance from inside with a thick slab of frozen snow. Darkness swallowed them whole. The only light came from a single lamp, its flame trembling against the cold. The sound outside was deafening. The dome shuddered under the assault of wind and ice, the walls flexing like the hull of a ship under waves. Each gust carried with it a strange, almost mournful moan, the voice of the storm itself echoing across the frozen desert. The Farron woman pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide, her breathing sharp and shallow. She wasn't used to such confinement. Her kind preferred open spaces and light. Evan glanced at her but said nothing. Words would only make the noise inside heavier. He simply adjusted the lamp's shield and leaned back against the opposite wall. He focused on the sound, the rhythm of the storm, the deep hum within the wind, the occasional sharp crack of distant ice fissures. It was chaos, but within that chaos, there was order. He could sense the storm's structure, waves of force rising and falling like an ocean. The dome creaked but held firm. Its curved design distributed pressure evenly, and the packed snow around its base anchored it to the frozen plain. For all its fragility, the structure behaved like something born of the planet itself, not against it. Hours passed, though time had no meaning in this endless night. The air inside the dome grew heavy with warmth and moisture. Condensation gathered again on the walls, freezing in small beads of frost. Evan moved quietly, adjusting the vents and occasionally scraping ice from the ceiling before it could thicken too much. The Farron woman watched him with something between confusion and reverence. Every movement he made was deliberate, measured, as if he understood the storm better than it understood him. At one point, a particularly violent gust struck the dome, hard enough to make the floor tremble. Snow burst through one of the ventilation slits, scattering frost across his face. The woman gasped, clutching her arms. Evan reacted instantly. He grabbed a spare block from his stockpile and pressed it against the slit, sealing it with his glove until the melting frost refroze the gap. He sat there for a long moment, palm against the cold surface, waiting to feel if the structure would hold. It did. The storm raged on, but his creation didn't yield. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up to both of them. He sat with his knees drawn up, his lamp between them, staring into the small flame that flickered in defiance of the wind outside. The woman spoke softly then, her voice barely audible. "How can you sleep through this?" she asked, her tone not accusatory but awed. Evan looked up slowly. "Because the storm can't come inside," he replied. "It only sounds powerful when you listen to it." His words hung in the air like the faint warmth from the lamp. She watched him a while longer, then leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, steadied. The night deepened. The storm grew worse. But inside, the silence became thicker, denser, almost sacred. Evan listened to his heartbeat, to the occasional creak of shifting ice. The noise outside transformed into a distant hum, and soon it no longer felt threatening. It felt like a pulse, the heartbeat of the planet itself. He thought about the cadets still scattered somewhere out there, the ones who hadn't found shelter. The image of them drifting through the snow haunted him, but he had learned to accept that survival demanded sacrifice. He couldn't save everyone. He could only endure and learn. As the hours stretched into what might have been dawn, the lamp began to dim. The chemical fuel was nearly spent. He could either extinguish it and conserve what little air remained, or let it burn out naturally. He chose the latter. The flame flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ancient spirits moving through ice. When it finally went out, darkness filled the dome completely. Yet it wasn't oppressive. The faint bioluminescence of the ice glowed softly, pale blue and alive, like veins of light beneath the surface. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The cold crept closer then, wrapping around him like a second skin. It wasn't painful. It was numbing, almost comforting. He had come to understand the cold, to respect it as part of the cycle. The Farron woman stirred slightly beside him, murmuring something in her own language. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was gentle. She was dreaming. He envied her for that. His own mind refused to rest fully, trapped between wakefulness and trance. In that half-conscious state, he listened to the whispers of the storm. They no longer spoke of death or destruction. They spoke of endurance. At some point, the vibrations changed. The wind lost its rhythm. The pressure outside lessened gradually, like the planet exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The dome stopped trembling. The sound diminished until only a soft hiss remained, the quiet murmur of snow settling across the ice fields. Evan opened his eyes. The air inside was still, dense with the scent of frost and melted wool. The storm was passing. He stood carefully, his joints stiff, his body heavy from hours of stillness. The entrance tunnel was packed with snow again. He carved it open with his knife, pushing until the frozen crust gave way. A flood of light spilled inside. Not sunlight exactly, but a pale silver glow reflected from the ice outside. He blinked against it. The world beyond the dome was unrecognizable. The plains had turned into a smooth, undulating sea of white. The storm had buried everything under a layer of new ice. The remains of the other camps were gone, erased completely. His dome stood alone, half buried but untouched. The woman stirred when the light reached her face. She blinked and then sat up slowly, confusion melting into awe as she saw the brightness beyond the entrance. "It's over," she whispered. Evan nodded. He stepped outside, his boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. The air was thin but calm, utterly silent except for the faint crackle of settling frost. He turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The horizon stretching endlessly in every direction, shimmering with a pale, almost metallic sheen. It looked like another world entirely. Behind him, the dome gleamed softly, its surface catching the light and scattering it in thousands of reflections. It looked fragile and eternal at the same time, as if the planet itself had chosen to preserve it as a symbol. The Farron woman emerged beside him, wrapping the wool around her shoulders. Her eyes widened at the sight. "Everything else is gone," she said quietly. Only this survived. Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth stood before them. They stood together in the silence, surrounded by the aftermath of nature's fury. For a long moment, there was no movement, no sound, only peace. The wind returned briefly, gentle now, brushing across the snow like a sigh. The planet had tested them, and they had endured. He looked at the horizon again and felt something shift inside him, a sense of belonging, a quiet connection to this merciless world. The storm had not been his enemy. It had been his teacher. When he turned back toward the dome, he saw it differently than before. It was no longer just a shelter. It was proof of understanding, a creation born from listening instead of defying. He brushed a hand across its curved surface, feeling the smoothness of the frozen wall. "It's alive," he murmured, almost to himself. The woman looked at him, puzzled. "The dome?" she asked. "No," he replied softly. "The storm." The sun, or what passed for it on Narith 9, rose higher, casting pale light across the endless ice. The night of silence had ended, but its lesson remained carved into both of them. The world outside had been wiped clean, and in that blankness lay possibility. The storm had taken everything, but it had left him something greater, the knowledge that harmony was stronger than defiance. He turned back toward the dome, ready to begin again. The day after the storm dawned with an unnatural calm. The air was clear for the first time in what felt like eternity, and the light that touched the frozen horizon was thin and metallic, like a blade sliding over glass. Evan stood at the crest of a snowdrift, watching how the world had transformed. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, smoothed by layers of new ice, unmarred by footprints or ruins. Everything man-made had been swallowed. The planet had erased every sign of defiance. Yet in the middle of that emptiness stood his dome, curved, unbroken, and glistening like a crystal heart. It caught the faint light of the sun and refracted it across the frozen plain, scattering shards of color that shimmered as the wind moved through them. Behind him, the Farron woman stirred within the dome. She emerged quietly, her crystalline skin refracting the pale light in hues of blue and silver. Her expression was calm, though there was a kind of reverence in the way she looked around. She had seen death in the storm's eyes and survived it, not by running, but by trusting the one being she had thought most fragile. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the air. Evan didn't reply. He watched the horizon with the quiet focus of someone who had seen beyond fear. For him, beauty wasn't the glow of the ice. It was the silence that followed destruction. He began to move across the frozen field, his steps slow but steady. Each footprint left a perfect imprint, then hardened instantly as the frost reclaimed it. The air was brittle, carrying faint echoes of cracking ice beneath the surface. He was searching for something, not rescue, not safety, but understanding. The planet had become more than terrain to him. It was a system, a living force, and he wanted to read it as one would read an ancient book. The storm had taught him that survival wasn't about control, but about rhythm. Every gust, every sound of shifting frost followed a pattern, and patterns could be learned. He stopped when he saw what remained of another camp buried beneath translucent ice. Through the layers, he could see outlines of crushed shelters and frozen figures. Alien shapes, some humanoid, some not, were sealed forever in the blue-white layers of the ground. The sight didn't shock him anymore. He pressed his hand against the ice, the cold biting through his glove, and bowed his head briefly. He wasn't mourning. He was acknowledging. Those who had built against nature had become part of it now. The planet didn't punish. It absorbed. In some way, they had all returned to balance. When he returned to the dome, the woman was tending to a small fire made from chemical fuel he had saved. She looked up at him as he approached, her expression mixed with fatigue and quiet admiration. "I saw something to the east," she said. "A signal flare, faint, but real." Evan nodded. The instructors must have finally descended from orbit to assess the aftermath. Rescue would come soon, but he didn't move toward it. Instead, he crouched beside the dome, inspecting its walls. The structure had survived 2 storms without damage. The ice had fused so tightly that it had become a single mass. Even now, its surface gleamed as if freshly built. She watched him for a while before asking, "You could leave now. Why stay?" He ran his hand over the wall, his fingers tracing the smooth curve. "Because I need to remember this," he said. "The world doesn't forgive arrogance. We forget that sometimes. This dome, this storm, it's a reminder that intelligence means nothing if it isn't humble." His words were simple, but she understood their weight. She had seen how her people's advanced shelters had shattered while his primitive creation had endured. As the sun climbed higher, faint outlines appeared in the sky. Shuttles descending slowly through the thin atmosphere, the survivors began to emerge from the white expanse, guided by beacons from the orbiting ships. Most were barely alive, staggering and hollow-eyed. The instructors in metallic suits moved among them, scanning for vital signs, documenting everything. When one of the officers approached the dome, his eyes widened in disbelief. "You built this?" he asked, his voice distorted through his helmet. Evan nodded. The officer circled the structure, taking measurements, touching the walls as though expecting them to crumble. "This shouldn't have lasted," the man muttered. "We lost every synthetic shelter in under 3 hours. And yet this—" Evan said nothing. There was no need to explain. The dome's existence spoke for itself. The officer recorded the coordinates and marked the site for further study. Then he gestured for Evan and the Farron woman to follow. The rescue shuttle waited nearby, its engines emitting soft ripples of heat that melted shallow pockets in the snow. As they walked, she looked back once at the dome. "Will it stay standing?" she asked quietly. Evan glanced over his shoulder. The structure gleamed under the rising light, flawless and still. "Yes," he said, "until the world decides to take it back." When the shuttle doors closed, the sudden warmth inside felt strange, too artificial, too sterile. He sat in silence as the engines roared and the ground fell away beneath them. Through the small viewing port, he saw the frozen plain shrinking, the dome becoming a tiny glint among the endless white. The higher they ascended, the more the planet resembled a mirror, a frozen sphere reflecting the sun with blinding brilliance. The storm scars were invisible from above. The surface looked perfect again. It struck him that the planet wasn't cruel or kind. It simply was. Back aboard the orbiting station, the cadets were gathered for debriefing. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with exhaustion and disbelief. Out of nearly 80 who had been sent to Narith 9, less than half had survived. The instructors spoke of data loss, environmental anomalies, and protocol failure. When it came time for Evan to speak, he rose slowly. The others turned toward him, expecting a story of luck or heroism, but his tone was calm, almost detached. "We weren't meant to fight the planet," he said. "We were meant to learn from it. Everything we built, everything we trusted, was designed to resist. That's why it failed. The storm wasn't the enemy. It was a teacher. I didn't survive because I was stronger. I survived because I listened." His words silenced the room. Some cadets lowered their heads. Others stared at him with the realization that their understanding of survival had been built on arrogance. The chief instructor, an older alien with translucent skin, regarded him thoughtfully before speaking. "Your report will be recorded as part of the Academy's Environmental Adaptation Program," he said. "You have demonstrated an approach our simulations never predicted." Evan only nodded. He didn't care about recognition. What mattered was the lesson itself. That night, as the station orbited high above the frozen planet, Evan stood by the observation window. The Farron woman joined him, her reflection shimmering faintly in the glass. Below them, Narith 9 glowed softly under the sun's distant rays, a vast white marble turning slowly in the void. "It looks peaceful from here," she said. He smiled faintly. "It always does, from a distance. But peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the moment you stop fighting what you don't understand." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded, understanding that his words weren't about the planet anymore. They were about everything. Long after the others had gone to rest, he remained at the window. The dome still stood down there, invisible to the naked eye but vivid in his mind. He imagined it glowing faintly in the eternal cold, untouched, holding its silence as the winds passed over it. To the planet, it was nothing, a speck, a temporary ripple in its vast existence. But to him, it was everything. It was the proof that harmony between mind and nature could exist even in the harshest places. When he finally turned away, he carried with him a new kind of calm. The Academy would document his methods, replicate his structure, and turn it into data. Others would test it, perhaps improve it, perhaps forget its origin. But none of that mattered. The real victory was internal. He had faced a world that could erase everything and found stillness within it. The storm that had once terrified him had become part of him, its rhythm, its patience, its strength. As the station drifted deeper into the dark side of orbit, he closed his eyes and let the silence surround him. There were no more storms left to fear. The cold, the wind, the endless ice, all of it had become familiar. The lesson was simple but absolute. Endurance was not about resisting the world. It was about becoming part of it. And somewhere far below, on the frozen plains of Narith 9, the dome of ice and wool stood quietly against the pale horizon, gleaming in the dawn that no longer threatened but embraced.